Great. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back. It's a pleasure to continue this exciting journey with everybody through a virtual series, Nurses Leading the Way, The Path to COP30. It's a meaningful partnership between the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments and the Society of Nurses, nurse scientists, innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders, two organizations that are deeply committed to supporting nurse-led action at the intersection of health, innovation, and environmental sustainability. So we're so glad you've joined us again or are here for the first time as we build momentum leading up to the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP30, taking place this November in Belém, Brazil. So this second session is COP 101, Understanding the Global Climate Talks and the Role of Nurses. It's a vital foundation for everything that follows. So today we'll unpack the process at COP, how it works, why it matters, and most importantly, how nurses and health professionals can have a seat and a voice at the global climate table. Let's get over to our learning objectives. So we will identify the structure, goal, and key outcomes of COP discussions. We'll discuss how nurses can influence and contribute to climate health policy and learn from nurses' firsthand experiences at COP. Because as the world's largest health workforce, nurses play a critical role not only in caring for those impacted by climate change, but in shaping the policies and systems that address its root causes. We're thrilled to be joined by a panel of nurse leaders who have attended past COP experiences and will share those experiences navigating this complex but powerful space. Their stories will offer insights to how nurses can contribute to climate policy, not just as observers, but as influencers and advocates for change. But first, we are going to hear from Sriram Madhusudanan from the U.S. Climate Action Network about the COP process, the most recent outcomes, and what is on the COP 2025 agenda. So Sriram is the international policy strategist with U.S. Climate Action Network and co-chairs their international policy committee. He's followed the UN climate treaty negotiations and attended a conference of the parties treaty meetings since COP22 in Bonn, Germany. He also works with climate justice organization Taproot Earth to advance climate reparations globally that centers Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty. Prior to this, he held a role to lead food and climate campaigns at Corporate Accountability, bringing together organizing, strategic communications, and hard-hitting research to end the life-threatening abuses of global corporations in the food and fast energy sectors. Welcome and thank you so much, Sriram.
Thank you all. And really, really happy to be here. I'll just, that was a great intro. I was going to have a little bit where I did an intro of myself, but I think you kind of captured all of the key points. I think that the one thing I'd add is, when I was leading one of the campaigns against McDonald's and the fast food industry at Corporate Accountability, I got an opportunity to work a lot with health professionals, including nurses, and really saw firsthand just the power of the personal testimony that frontline healthcare workers like you all bring to issues like this. I think you really add something that those of us who are activists or even scientists can't really bring in such a powerful way. So excited to talk with y'all about how nurses can have a huge impact on climate policy, and especially advancing climate justice, not just in your own roles where you are delivering care. And I've certainly seen that going into hospitals, seeing how much the interactions with nurses makes such a big difference in the healthcare setting, but also having that power in advocacy settings as well. One thing I will say before I get into like a lot of the wonkiness around COP, which I can do for far too long, and I'll set a timer so I don't bore you with all of the technical details. But I did just want to give a little bit of background about the U.S. Climate Action Network, where so I'm staff with them, international policy strategist, in addition to working with Taproot, and also co-chair the International Policy Committee. U.S. Climate Action Network, really brings together a diverse array of over 170 U.S.-based organizations, Alliance of Nurses for a Healthy Environment. I hope I'm getting your name right. I was like practicing that. But is definitely one of them. Get to work very closely with Kara Cook on our International Policy Committee. And, you know, as a network, we're really working to address the climate crisis by centering justice and equity. We're a US node of Climate Action Network International, whose membership spans more than 1,900 civil society organizations around the world. And you know, I think the core of this is we really do believe in the power of organizing. The more organizations and movements around the world that can come together advancing what we know we need in this world in terms of justice and equity, especially on climate, the more likely we are to achieve it. We've been around as US can and engaged in the UN climate negotiations going back to, I think, before there was even a UN climate treaty. I was looking back at some of our history. But certainly going back to the beginning of the UN climate negotiations process, which I'll walk through a little bit of that history here. And our work is also anchored by members who work to advance climate justice from the local settings to the global level. So we're really committed to making sure our US based members are leading this work. So I co-chair the International Policy Committee, where our members who are focused on the international work really come together and identify how do we need to really move in this moment to not just move and advocate to government and public policy officials here in the US, but also ensure that we're in alignment with our global partners, especially those in the global South, who, as I'll talk about in a little bit, are the ones who are really seeing firsthand in so many ways the impacts of a problem they did very little to cause. So a little bit of like a roadmap for the presentation. I'll try not to spend too much time on it, but I think it is always helpful to have like a little bit of a grounding in this process we call the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. How did it come about? What's the path that's gotten us to here? I think this is very important when we engage in these processes because certainly the institutional memory of a lot of the folks who've been attending these negotiations is very long, especially when you're talking about developing country parties or countries who have really been fighting for their lives, for the lives of their people for so long, and certainly the movements that have been supporting them throughout this process. I'll talk a little bit, kind of big picture, about civil society engagement at the UNFCCC and what that looks like. And then kind of to land and would love to have some space for Q&A, but just kind of land with both the outcomes of COP29, where that ended up, and agenda for COP30. And then a little bit on key milestones and moments to engage. But how's that sound? Definitely ready to go into like details around some of these, which could spend way too much time on, but I'm happy to just kind of give an overall background to start us off. So before I get into that history, just to ground in a climate justice perspective, you know, when we talk about climate justice, what does that mean? I think at the core of it, right, like climate impacts there are impacts that people are feeling because of climate change the world over. You all see that in so many different settings and contexts. However, the the fact of the matter is that communities that are less resource, that are already subject to so many systemic oppressions, and certainly that are on the front lines of this crisis, are being hit first and worse. And certainly in a global context, not everyone is equally responsible for fueling the crisis. And so this is just one graphic that helps lay this out. It's from a few years ago, but was from a New York Times analysis. And this is like one of the core issues at the UN climate talks is not just who is responsible for fueling the climate crisis, but who is responsible for, because of fueling the crisis, paying for the impacts that people are seeing, in some cases, loss and damage, irreparable loss and damage that people are feeling. And so it's pretty inescapable that the richest, most developed economies in the world, the United States, lead among them about a fourth of all carbon emissions that are in the atmosphere right now, which take hundreds of years to come out, is from the US. the economies of most of the European Union and the other kind of developed country groups that we think of. Typically, this is also in the G7. We'll get to country groupings a little later. Japan, Australia, the UK, in addition, are really about almost half, if not, it changes every year as this shifts, but it's almost half of carbon emissions. Certainly, historical emissions are because of that. China is very big as well. I think there's no escaping that. Yet, China is, when you look at its population on a per capita basis, it's still like per person, its carbon emissions are much smaller than, say, the US, EU, many other countries. So, we see this and we compare it with, say, if you look at Africa here, which the countries of Africa, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but they're in this square right here. Now, many countries in Africa are already seeing mass displacement, threats to food security, ecological devastation just because of the temperature rise that they're facing. The Philippines is another country that is seeing superstorms that are hitting them directly, and yet are responsible for I'm not even sure if I can quite find them on this map, but yes, right there, Philippines, they don't even have enough room for a number there. So less than a half of a percent. So again, these are the issues of climate justice that are really central to this issue of climate change. And of course, when we're looking at many of these countries that are still developing their economies, they need resources to provide health care for citizens on the ground. They're also dealing with massive amounts of air pollution. Like I've from India, my family is in the south of India, but we hear many reports oftentimes about cities like Delhi where the pollution is so bad. I mean, I deal with wildfire smoke here in Montana and can't imagine what happens when the index gets to be above 300 or 400, as I've seen at times in cities like Delhi. So again, these are many overlapping crises that are making the situation much worse in developing countries. So to shift from there to the background and history of the UN FCCC, really this path began in 1988 with the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. Maybe if we can get like a quick show of hands, how many folks have like heard of the IPCC before? It's like one of that alphabet soup of acronyms you probably hear a lot around climate stuff. So they're the group that every few years comes out with another report on like, here's the latest of what climate science around the world is saying. It's been around since 1988. And I think that was really the beginning where the scientific community was trying to say, oh, like there were some indications. Oil companies like Exxon and Shell knew much earlier, but this was really the time in the 1980s, late 1980s, where I think on the heels of a global environmental movement, people were really starting to understand, wow, we are affecting the world's climate in a way that we hadn't previously thought was possible or really understood. That led in a short 4 years to the Rio Earth Summit, which was, I think, a moment of great optimism. You'll see in the history since then, there are some big challenges that are unresolved. But that really led to, among other things, the adoption of what's known as the UN Climate Treaty, or the UNFCCC. I'll use UNFCCC as the sort of shorthand here, but that's really the framework convention on climate change. A framework convention in UN speak basically means a global treaty. And by 1994, the UNFCCC entered into force. I might be dating myself here, but then a few years later, we had something called the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first attempt globally to try and get the climate change issue under control. The Kyoto Protocol is worlds apart in terms of where we are now, but it was a legally binding mechanism to try and reduce climate emissions. Not only that, but one of the things that I think are important to know about about the Kyoto Protocol was that it was really clear on who was most responsible for driving climate change, with that onus being put very squarely on the shoulders of rich countries, developed countries. However, in the early 2000s, the second Bush administration withdrew the US from the Kyoto Protocol. So basically, this is sort of a shift of administrations. It was largely negotiated under the Clinton administration. Al Gore, at the time, who's still very active in the climate space, was one of the folks who were really pushing for this, but it was not adopted. And I think at the time, the really pushback from the Republican administration, Republican Congress, in addition to the Bush administration, was instrumental in that. Certainly, a rise of a lot of climate denialism at that particular moment in time, which has shifted to now, but we'll get into that later. We can get into that later. In 2009, the Obama administration began a push for a new climate agreement. However, they made a very important distinction from the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol was a legally binding mechanism. There are still countries that, do abide. There are meetings of the Kyoto Protocol in countries that do abide by that. But because the US is not a player in it, it's not really as critical to the core of how the world is addressing the issue of climate change. The Obama administration began in 2009 to make a push around getting to a new agreement that would be the Paris Agreement, what we now call the Paris Agreement. Um, and there were a lot of negotiations along the way around some of the issues like climate finance, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But there were some critical moments along there, including in 2013, where there was an adoption of a mechanism, the Warsaw Implementation Mechanism, or Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage. And in 2015, in a moment of great fanfare, the Paris Agreement was adopted. However, importantly, the Paris Agreement is not legally binding. There is only one kind of operative sentence on what countries shall do as part of the Paris Agreement, and that is submit national climate plans, or NDCs, which stands for nationally determined contributions. So really the last 10 or so years, since from the adoption of the Paris Agreement to now, has been about the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So, in particular, 2022, after many years of negotiations, there was a rule book that was adopted on the Paris Agreement, which is like, how are we implementing these critical elements of the Paris Agreement? So, there are articles of the Paris Agreement that deal with everything from issues like climate finance to loss and damage, all of the different elements of the ecosystem that need to be changed in order to address climate change. And the 2022 really resulted in the guidelines for implementation. But there are some themes that keep coming up time and again, some critical issues in the context of the UN Climate Treaty. And one which I've sort of like introduced under another name or using different language, but I'll just kind of give you the wonky term here is something called CBDR, which is Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. It's actually the full acronym is CBDR-RC, which is Common but Differentiated Responsibilities and Respective Capacities. And it basically is not just that question of who's most responsible for driving climate change and how do we bear that responsibility differently, but also who's most capable of providing support to the entire world to transition off of fossil fuels and to renewable forms of energy. This is an issue that keeps coming up time and again because as many developing country parties see it, it is still the responsibility of, those rich countries on the left side of that graph that I showed to be responsible for the problem that they've caused. You broke something, you buy it. You break it, you buy it, right? Like that's the approach that they're taking. And yet, the United States in particular, even under the Biden and Obama administrations, are really trying to, as much as they can, get out of the responsibility that they have for addressing the climate crisis, or certainly they don't want to be on the hook, or certainly to use a term that they've particularly pushed back against, be seen as liable for causing the problem. We'll get into climate litigation and liability. We can get into that later, but that is increasingly coming for those who've been feeling the crisis, whether we like it or not. But this is a critical theme and important issue within the context of the COPs itself. The second is loss and damage and climate finance. So loss and damage And maybe just to see, is this loss and damage familiar? Have folks kind of heard or heard a little bit about this issue before? Okay. So a little bit, seeing a few nods there. Loss and damage really is talking about a realm of impacts from climate change that are irreversible. And sadly, a lot of islands are considering this, like what happens when you have sea level rise where you've lost land? Many Pacific Island countries are literally thinking about where do our people go if our islands no longer exist. And already land loss, intrusion, loss of drinking water is happening in many of these low-lying islands and coastal areas. So there is loss and damage that's actively happening right now. This is also kind of gets into the category of impacts from climate fueled catastrophes, right? So, in the aftermath of a massive hurricane or super typhoon, what happens? And the thing is, a lot of countries that are facing these impacts don't have the resources to address the community's needs directly without going to getting loans from private loans or sometimes from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which then creates a debt crisis that is happening at the same time as the climate crisis. So these issues are very important. Loss and damage. There was a fund that was created in Sharm el-Sheikh a few years ago at the COP in Egypt, but it has not been funded to the extent that it needs to be to meet the scale of loss and damage and climate impacts that are happening right now. And climate finance is another critical issue, right? So not just in terms of loss and damage, but across the board for countries to transition off of fossil fuels, for them to adapt. So, deal with climate impacts that are before fully irreversible loss and damage. How do we do that? And how do we do that in a way where the finance is public? It's ideally as much as possible grant-based and is not creating deeper inequities or levels of debt crisis that are continuing the problem. There's also a just and equitable phase out of fossil fuels, right? So, who should be the first to phase out fossil fuels to transition their economies to renewable energy? I mean, should it be the Philippines? Should it be Ethiopia? Or even, I mean, there's fossil fuel producing economies in the global south. Brazil, where the next COP is going to be, is one of those. Most of their energy makeup is actually hydropower, which has some issues and concerns itself. But are they the most responsible? Should they be the first ones for phasing out fossil fuels? These are very important also for development concerns because fossil fuels are, for lack of a better term, in much of the world, the basis of the economy and production. So if you're shutting that down, how is that creating cascading effects across the world? And then carbon markets, which, I can go more into this, but I would really start and stop by saying carbon markets are really, they're very prevalent in the discourse. And unfortunately, they are really a false solutions that have been pushed by the fossil fuel industry to be able to create ways to continue polluting. And unfortunately, because there's so little climate finance that's coming through, they're being sold as a solution, like let us pollute here and we'll pay you to allow for that. I'm gonna kind of skip ahead through maybe a couple of the next ones and happy to come back if we want to go into it a little bit more deeply just for the sake of time. But one of the important things to know about how the UNFCCC works, and this is a little crazy for me the first time I stepped into this space, is that it works entirely on a consensus basis. So there's 193, 194 parties to the UNFCCC. I mean, if you can think about going out with five friends and trying to all decide on one place that you want to go and have dinner, I've been in that situation. That is not an easy consensus to arrive at. And now you're doing that with 194 countries who all have their different agendas, their different political contexts, all to arrive at that consensus in a period of 2 weeks. So it is a marathon. It starts a successful COP. Usually, the work and the foundation that is laid out happens months and months ahead of actually arriving at the conference. And a lot of the work for advancing it is done through negotiating blocks. And I'm like very, very much oversimplifying it here, but some of the key blocks and power dynamics to know about, excuse me, are the G7, which is really those global north countries, a lot of them kind of involved in the rich country left side of the graph that I showed earlier. So the United States, the European Union, the UK, Japan, Australia, are key players here. New Zealand, I think, as well, Canada, um, and they usually work as a united front and bloc in the context of the climate negotiations. And then there's the global south, which is very big. You have the G77 plus China, which is actually closer to more than 100 countries, excuse me, and have different regional blocs. The AGN, for example, is the Africa Group of Negotiators. ILAC and ALBA are two major negotiating blocs in Latin America. And you also have some that are based off of shared issues or experiences. So LDCs is the least developed countries, or the AOSIS, which is Association of Small Island States. Excuse me. I can provide this slide deck afterwards, but this gives you some sense of the many intersecting, overlapping negotiating groups that are here. But G77 plus China is a really powerful negotiating bloc and often acts as a counterweight to the G7. If anything needs to move that the global South countries are really lining up behind, it's got to move with the G77 plus China as a united bloc. The the second thing I'll touch on is civil society at the UNFCCC. So there are many ways in which observers show up at the UNFCCC. Among those are rights-based constituencies. So you have the environmental NGOs, which is where we fall as a member of CAN International. DCJ, the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, is the other major constituency within the NGOs. There's TUNGO, which is the trade unions, the Women and Gender constituency, and Indigenous Peoples Caucus. There's also YOUNGO, which is like anyone who's young and basically under, I think 35 is the limit, or maybe it's 30, I forget which one. Farmers, which is it's a mix of different groups, but I would say they're not always there are groups that are active within the farmers constituency, but it's not one of the most active rights-based ones that I've seen. The research institutions, or RINGO, which is sometimes independent research institutions, sometimes it's research institutions that have a lot of funding from corporate interests. So there is like sort of a mixed bag there. And then business and industry NGOs, which I will say the focal point for that is the International Chamber of Commerce. So there's a number of trade associations, including trade associations connected to the fossil fuel industry, that are very active um, among bingos. And then there are also a lot of media and press that engage, that's a way that you can engage and follow the negotiations. But there are often dedicated spaces where civil society can kind of speak and attest to their perspectives or engage with government delegates, and address the full plenary. There are a number of other ways inside the official negotiations, or the blue zone, where civil society can, whether it's through press events, hosting side events, discussing critical issues, or organizing sanctioned actions within the space, or directly lobbying government officials, can really make their views and perspectives known. And there's also an outside space, which is a little bit more sometimes for networking, building stronger coalitions. This year, the People Summit in particular in Belém, I think, is going to be very big, and is another space to engage, to share perspectives, and to build stronger coalitions. And depending on the location, sometimes it's allowed for there to be a large demonstration or march on the outside as well, to draw attention to human rights issues, and other demands that are coming from civil society. Do I have maybe like 2 minutes to wrap up on the COP29 outcomes and COP30? Okay. So I think I'll start by saying that COP29 was unfortunately pretty disappointing. This was a year that was really meant to be a moment where a strong deal was reached on climate finance. The demand from global South countries was for $1 trillion a year, which is definitely a big number. And at the same time, it's a small portion of the rising costs that are related to addressing climate change right now. And the agreed to goal, which was where things ended, was about $300 billion a year by 2030. So there's many ways in which global South countries and social movements in particular are seeing that as pretty insufficient. One, it's far short of the goal that was demanded and needed. Secondly, there's no real clarity on, are we talking about public dollars here? Are we talking about private dollars? So there's no real methodology for who is actually contributing to make and reach this goal. The last time there was a goal on climate finance, which was part of the road to getting the Paris Agreement, opening the negotiations for that, it was $100 billion a year, which was supposed to be met by 2020. That was only met by 2020 3 or 4. It was a few years late, and not only that, but often the accounting for it in truth that was probably much like 20 to 30 billion dollars that was actually met there. So there is a negotiation this year around what's called the Baku to Belém roadmap, which the idea is part of the compromise was like, well, we're going to get to 1.3 trillion. We can commit to 300 billion now. We're going to get to 1.3 trillion. This roadmap is going to show how we're going to mobilize even more resources to get there. So that's what is going to be a big agenda item for COP30, in addition to a just transition work program, which is supposed to operationalize and show exactly how countries are moving to and accelerating a transition off of fossil fuels, taking care of workers in the process of doing that, and also being mindful of justice issues that are there in human rights when it comes to renewable energy, especially the critical minerals that are dependent on those supply chains. There should be updated national climate goals, which will show us how far or off track we are in meeting the global goal for keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius or a rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And because this is the first COP that's happening in the Amazon, I think for sure issues related to the Amazon forest protection, the rights of indigenous peoples and indigenous communities in the Amazon in particular are going to be both something that the government of Brazil and other kind of neighboring governments are going to want to talk about in the region, as well as a place where civil society is going to be raising a lot of powerful demands and important perspectives. Okay, I'll skip the milestones bit. Lots of things happening on the road to COP, including the New York Climate Week and the UN General Assembly in September. And in June, the intersessional negotiations will happen where there will be a much more kind of clear agenda on like what's actually going to be discussed at COP, what's on track, what's off track. So I'll pause there and Grace, pass it back to you. Happy to take some questions. And also I've been talking for a while, so also happy to close my mouth and listen.
Yeah, maybe we'll share or save rather your voice, and maybe we can do a combo of Q&A at the end. I really hope that you're able to stay with us for the second half of the session. Um, right now, I would love to introduce a friend of mine and somebody who's really done some amazing work at so many levels and in so many ways to support nursing advocacy and engagement in this space. So Charlotte McArdle was previously the Deputy CNO for Quality, Safety, and Sustainability in Women's Health at NHS England, where she led the Women's Health Program and the nursing and midwifery profession's response to sustainable healthcare, including a role in tackling climate change. In another previous role as a CNO in the Department of Health for Northern Ireland, She was responsible for the professional leadership performance and development and led the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Charlotte has extensive experience working in government administration, shaping strategic policy and partnership, working systems transformation, and a slew of global health expertise, with a particular focus in developing young nurses and midwives globally. A graduate of the Florence Nightingale Executive Leadership Program and the ICN Global Nurse Leadership Institute, she's also a credentialed global nurse consultant. Charlotte received an honorary doctorate and is a researcher and visiting professor at Ulster University in Belfast and a fellow of the Queen's Nursing Institute and board member of the Faculty of Nursing and Midwifery at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. She's the vice chair of the RCN Foundation and a Sigma Nursing Liaison Officer to the United Nations, as well as having been an attendee at COP previously. So thank you so much for being here, Charlotte. Please take it away.
Thanks so much, Grace, and hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and what an interesting presentation we've just had on the nuts and bolts of COP. And having been there, I think is really useful to be able to contextualize that even myself. I had the opportunity to be in at COP last year in Baku in Azerbaijan, and it was my first experience there. And I've reflected on why it's important, on my experience, and why it's important for us as a profession to have a voice at COP, which has driven me to work with Soncia and Annie in delivering these events in the run up to COP30. And I think what I would say is there is definitely the need for a stronger, but not just a stronger voice, a coordinated voice for nursing at COP. And that includes speaking opportunities. And the reason that I say that is, firstly, it's very hard to get tickets for COP. I got mine from Annie. There were 5 of us there. Outside of our group, Millie was also with us. But outside of our group, we found it really difficult to identify and connect other nurses. And of all the 65,000 people that I think were in Baku, there were 5 nurses. There may have been 1 or 2 others that we didn't reach, but we're not talking about 10 or 20 or 100. We're certainly not talking about 1% of the overall population that attended COP. So we got ourselves together in a small group and we tried to influence where we can. We agreed key messages and we asked questions and etc. etc. 1 or 2 of us had the opportunity to be on panels. I spoke on the UK panel about developing capacity and capability in the nursing workforce for skills and competencies around making change happen, particularly in clinical pathways, and how nurses are well placed to advocate for change, working in local communities and knowing their populations well. So what we kind of discussed was the ability to coordinate the action in advance of COP so that whoever is there from whatever country, there are a couple of key messages. And I think that that's particularly important because we've just had the release of the second State of the World's Nursing report launched on International Nurses Day, which thankfully recognises climate change as an emergent area of policy, and which also suggests that government chief nursing officers have a particular role in enabling and developing policy at health ministry level. And this brings me to my second point. Having been a government chief nursing officer myself over a long period of time and recognising where we can and should be making a contribution and influencing policies, I didn't see any government chief nursing officers at COP. That is not a criticism of my colleagues, but that reflects that responsibility for climate doesn't often sit in ministries of health. It often sits in other ministries like transport, communities, finance, and therefore there needs to be a greater focus on health in all policies across government. And that's where I think the government chief nursing officers can have a role, but they can only have that role if they're present in the conversation. So it's an opportunity, I think, for us to reflect how we make that happen. It's great to hear, and I was really delighted that health did form part of the discussion, even though there was a big focus on finance last year. but it does need to be mainstreamed much more into like the central core discussion at COP, because health actually, from our perspective, and I suspect from everybody's perspective, if they understood it, would say that health is actually the reason for climate action, because it is the impact on health that is most significant and severe and long lasting, both in terms of our current population, but for future generations to come. So I think getting that message out to other industries and other sectors is really important, that health is the reason for climate action. And of course, to be able to do that, you've got to understand health. And that's why nurses are very well placed to lead that conversation, because they're seeing the impacts of health. And frequently at COP last year, there was a discussion about how you transfer national policy to local delivery and local implementation. And I was really, really taken aback by the lack of discussion about healthcare professionals and particularly nurses in this space. So examples were Canada, Brazil, and Spain all talking about their national climate action policies. So if you take Spain, they had just had normally they're dealing with heat, but on this occasion it was floods, and they were talking about how the central government were unable to get key messages out to people at local level, and how the public just thought these floods were going to be the same as every other flood. And so I stuck my hand up and said, well, nurses are working, living in communities. They're the most trusted profession. Why did you not consider using them to get those messages across? The same in Canada when they're talking about creating sheltered areas, outdoor space to keep the heat off people. Again, the translation of that into what that means in your daily life and how it affects your health is really important. And I think there's just such a big void there, particularly for nursing as the most trusted profession to fill. But again, if we're not at the table and we're not saying we can do this, we've experience of doing this, we've done it for years, we did it all during COVID actually. We are well placed to do this. And finally, the communication on things like weather alerts and warnings are just not getting out in time, and people are not heeding them, and they need the support of a healthcare. So, for all those reasons, I think it's really important that we have a stronger, coordinated, joined up voice of the profession at COP. And I would really love to see whoever is there have some of those messages that they can deliver in whatever opportunities they get. Thanks, Grace.
I appreciate all that so much, and thank you for being here. And I hope that this series helps nurses see how they can engage in such a way, even if they can't be on the ground in Brazil. More on that to come. But right now, I want to share again yours truly, our Milagros Elia. She is the advanced practice registered nurse with over 25 years of combined experience in nursing and planetary health. She provides professional presentations and educational workshops to academic institutions and medical organizations interested in providing students or healthcare staff information on the impact of climate change on health. As a certified Climate for Health ambassador, she speaks internationally about how climate change impacts our health and the scope of solutions for individuals and organizations. She's the immediate past chair of the National ANA Innovation Advisory Committee for Planetary and Global Health, and currently sits as the member of the National Association of Hispanic Nurses Policy and Advocacy Committee. She's the current program manager for climate and clean energy advocacy for ANA and attended the last two COPs. Please, Millie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Grace. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak at in this series. I have attended the last two COPs, and I want to really focus on something that our executive director here at ANI, Dr. Huffling, noted from last year's COP, which really echoes and bounces off what Shahram, what you were mentioning about the finances. As nurses, we are increasingly very astute and aware of what goes into the climate and health aspects of COP, and that includes finances. And COP29, as you mentioned, failed to deliver an outcome that prioritizes health and justice by ensuring that countries that are bearing the burden of the climate crisis have the financing needed to adequately respond to climate-related impacts. And so we understand that the deal that was forced through in that COP, despite objections from countries in the global South, was grossly inadequate and significantly short of at least $1.3 trillion. And unfortunately, at that time, the Biden administration did not release the updated National Determined Contribution, or NDC. And so with that, as nurses, as a nursing organization, Annie itself continues to work on mobilizing global health advocacy in these areas, inclusive of the financing needed. And we do that through nursing participation at COP. And so you heard from Charlotte McCardle, Dr. McCardle, who we offered an invitation. Please join us, as well as other colleagues on the line, such as Imogen Stringer. But we do this to foster international collaborations among health professionals, not only among ourselves, as Dr. McCardle mentioned, there was 5 of us, but it is important to build bridges. And what do nurses do best? We build bridges. We connect the dots. So in building those collaborations internationally among health professionals and across sectors, empowering our nurses to really advocate collectively for climate resilient healthcare systems and stronger environmental policies worldwide. We really look to support our nurses in understanding the health impact and raising awareness. Nurses, as my colleagues have mentioned, witness firsthand how climate change affects public health, such as with the rising respiratory illnesses, heat-related conditions. I can tell you, I just recently represented Annie at a conference in Switzerland. And I went to Switzerland ignorantly thinking the Swiss are ahead of the game. I'm sure they know. I'm sure that no. They did not realize that their country is heating up 2 to 3 times faster than other regions, and the Alps are melting. So this awareness is throughout the it's globally. And so when I speak to nurses here and there, I emphasize educating ourselves and then we can educate others. When we are talking about vector-borne diseases, a clear connection to the climate crisis, and how nurses can powerfully advocate for climate action through a health equity lens. As Dr. McCardle mentioned, we are the most trusted profession. So the communities trust our voice. And as such, nurses can effectively communicate that urgency around climate issues to patients, policymakers, and the general public. Again, we help bridge the gap between science and community engagement. We foster leadership in the space of sustainable healthcare. Nurses play a key role in promoting environmental sustainable practices within their own healthcare systems and can organize initiatives that reduce the sector's carbon footprint while also improving patient care outcomes. We bring a health perspective, again, to climate policy. I just want to highlight that for a moment. Nurses can highlight the direct and disproportionate impacts of climate change on human health. So as it relates to COP 30, our presence really helps to ensure that the global climate negotiations, these conversations that are happening at COP, prioritize health outcomes along with climate justice. And lastly, I'll say we help to really highlight and elevate that frontline experience at the community level. As frontline healthcare providers, nurses can share that real world story experience and data, the all-important data from our most vulnerable communities, grounding climate discussions in lived experiences and emphasizing the human cost of inaction. And this is I promise this will be the last thing I say. When it comes to, Jerem had mentioned community voices. and some of those were like youths and other participants, but across, and I say this all the time, globally, everywhere I have spoken, including here in the US, the one group that never gets mentioned, and so I always make it a point to mention them, is there is a Global Disability Alliance that was present at COP. The Disabilities Coalition needs to be recognized. This is maybe a small point to some of our listeners, but it's not a big point. It's a huge point for them. COP29 was absolutely not accessible to those in wheelchairs and who had trouble walking. So are we really being inclusive? I leave you with that question. Thank you.
It's a really great point, and I so appreciate Annie being that kind of coordinating mechanism to bring all those points together, to bring nurses from all different practice settings together, just as that mirrors the way that the UN is a coordinating mechanism for all these countries and regions. And last but not least, the way we're going to again coordinate together, coming from Annie Latino America, we have Dean Dorian Camacho, an environmental nursing leader working on to incorporate climate and health education and environmental justice into the nursing profession across Latin America. As Dean of Nursing Faculty at Universidad Cooperativa de Colombia, Campus Santa Marta, Ms. Dorian Camacho led the university in becoming the first Latin American pilot partner of the Nurses Climate Challenge School of Nursing Commitment. So please take it away, Dorian.
Thank you so much. Well, I have a short time, so I just want to say that I was at COP28 in Dubai, and it was an amazing opportunity because we had the voice from Latin American nurses, and that's great because our countries are maybe one of the most vulnerable in the world, and we need to improve the advocacy, and we need to move our nurses to talk about health and climate change. Actually, right now we are working about all the subjects related with the participation of nurses in the associations, and to talk with the governments, and to talk with another alliance from nurses. And we are working with universities and hospitals in all the continent because we need to improve the capacities of our nurses to work with health and climate change, and to work with emergencies. Actually, this is new for us. So the information that we received at COP was important to talk with our nurses, to prepare our nurses. And we hope to be this year in Brazil. And actually, we are working here with another nurses, with Erica, she's here right now. And we are working because we need to talk about what is happening here in Latin America and what can do the nurses in Latin America. That's really important. So besides all that you said, I believe it's important to have the voices from our countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Camacho. And, just for the sake of time, I'm going to give like a rapid fire question. I would like to ask all of our three nurse panelists, just give me a one-liner, a quick response to, as nurses are the largest, if you were to bring, as nurses, the largest and most trusted profession, if you were to BYOB, bring your own buddy, your nurse buddy to COP30, how would you convince them to go? Make it urgent for them, understand their place there. What would you tell them that is your hopeful outcome in the future as a result of your presence there? And Dr. Camacho, can I start with you?
Yes, of course. Well, we need to include climate action plans and support hospitals in their climate emergency preparedness plans. And we need to be there, and we need to talk, and we need to talk for the communities here in Latin America, the indigenous communities, the vulnerable communities, and we need to talk. We are the bigger group of professional health in the hospitals. We have the voice. So we need to tell them about what can we do and what are we doing. So we hope that many nurses come to us, to Brazil, to talk and to say the governments, we are here because we need to work for many people and we are an important part of health communities, and please let us to work for those communities. Thank you.
Well, Millie, I'm going to pass it over to you. Quick rapid fire. BYOB, bring your own buddy.
Well, I have the distinct pleasure of being the nurse panelist from the US. And this particular moment in time in history makes me want to express the need for nurses to really represent climate and health through that health equity lens, which is really being compromised here in the US at this moment. And so I would tell any nurse, if you believe in environmental justice, now is the time to represent yourself, represent your communities, represent the US, and represent us well, because our government is choosing a different pathway.
That's right. And back over to you across the pond, Charlotte.
Thanks. Nurses are, from my perspective, nurses and healthcare professionals are already dealing with a significant impact on climate change. We've touched briefly on them, and I'm not going to rehearse them, but we all know in our different contexts what they are, whether it's air pollution, cancer, whatever. So we're dealing with it and have been dealing with it. The bottom line is that we cannot have a healthy population on a sick planet. Those two things just will not work together. And I think it's illustrating that in the context of COP is really important. And the final thing I would say is, for me, climate change is equivalent to major patient safety issues. The World Health Organization tell us first do no harm. Our professional regulators tell us first do no harm. We're doing harm to the planet. We are doing harm to our people. And they, for me, are the key messages which nurses can articulate with experience of what that looks like and feels like in their local everyday populations, work, life.
Thank you. And I just wanted to throw it back to you, Saram. Any questions from our audience specifically to what he covered? If not, I've got maybe a quick one I could ask, but I'm going to leave it open to the audience really quick. Okay, so Saram, I'm going to ask you, now that you've heard from us, you work with nurses all the time, what do you think, just a quick one-liner, what is the best way for us to combat the climate denialism and reframe the discussions to find that consensus that you're talking about that the UNFCCC is supposed to uphold?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And I think a lot of it is just rooted in what my fellow speakers have been bringing, right? Like speak to the real life testimony, what you're seeing on the front lines. I think that's so powerful. And I do think that oftentimes, I live in Montana. It's not the place where climate is necessarily the very place you begin the conversation, but people are noticing things. We notice that the wildfire season is longer here. We notice that the snowpack is less. We know that the rivers are lower at the same time as they were last year. And so people are, at some level, I want to believe that people are seeing and experiencing this even at an intuitive level. And it's a question of finding where is that place that you can agree that aligns with their personal experience and connect it to these bigger issues. Because I think some of the polling that's been coming out is actually very interesting in that people are starting to see and connect these issues more, and they're also connecting it with especially the fossil fuel industry and the entities that have been fueling this crisis for so long. So I think that there's a lot of sort of a choose your own adventure, but like where is the place that you can find that that people are seeing and experiencing this, and how can we connect it to the values and what we need in this moment. I really loved what Dr. McCardle said. There can't be healthy people on a sick planet. I think that's so important to hold and remind people of.
That's right. And I think as the most trusted profession, as was mentioned, that we can find that shared value, right? We meet patients and people where they're at. And one way that we are offering and asking and sharing for all nurses around the world, no matter if it's on the ground or virtually, is to share that message. And what you can do is attach the hashtag Nurses Path to COP. This is our path to engaging and representing our voice, whether we're on the ground or not. And this is the winning hashtag that you all helped us vote upon. So this is what we're going to be sharing for everything else related to this series and nurses going and leading up to COP-related events in November. And I will just close quickly in the last minute. Thank you so much for taking 5 minutes more with us. Our next session is going to be, let me switch the slide, June 25th at noon Eastern New York time. We can get the registration link in the chat soon. This will be Climate Action at the Front Lines, Nurses Shaping Global Policy at COP and beyond. So join us for an inspiring and action-oriented webinar spotlighting the essential role of nurses in driving climate solutions from local communities to the global stage. Climate Action at the Front Lines, Nurses Shaping Global Climate Policy at COP and Beyond will explore how climate action is directly relevant to nursing practice and professional organizations. And through stories of frontline leadership and advocacy, you'll hear nurses are making an impact locally, influencing this policy globally. And we'll be sharing a sneak peek of our upcoming social media and digital action campaign coming up this fall to help amplify the nurses' voices in climate advocacy and derive collective impact with that hashtag. We'd love your input to help shape this campaign as well, so don't miss this chance to connect and vote on our social media campaign. Thank you so much, everybody. I wish you a great morning, afternoon, evening, and the rest of your week. Thank you to all of our panelists. See you again soon.